Since then, it's been very difficult for our family because my dad's health hasn't been great and we are always afraid of when we might lose him. Naturally, as his only son, I want to be here for him and also for my mother, and so I hadn't wanted to move away after my dad's diagnosis. I thought that Emma would understand what I was going through, but instead, she told me that I was being a little too sensitive and that I can't just keep turning down opportunities to work out of state and expect her to do the same just because my dad was sick. Before my dad fell sick, we had actually been planning to move away because she wanted a change of pace. But after my father's diagnosis, I told her that it would not be possible for me anymore. She tried to be understanding of it in the beginning, but gradually, since last year or so, she had started to become very restless. And we had been fighting quite frequently over this. She wanted to move away because she felt stuck here, and I couldn't possibly think about moving away while my dad was in such a condition, especially since it would also mean having to leave my mother to deal with it all on her own. Even if I had had any siblings, I wouldn't have been able to leave because my conscience wouldn't have let me. And I kept trying to explain that to Emma, but she refused to see my point. And I just felt like she was being selfish. Whereas she felt like I was the one being selfish. And then earlier this year, she just came home from work one day and told me that she had applied for a high-paying position in a company outside of state and she got the job. That came as a shock to me and I wanted to be happy for her, but I just couldn't because she hadn't told me anything about this application or this job. I was kind of in shock, so I just congratulated her and then I said nothing. That day, I remember we got into an argument because she didn't think I was happy enough for her even though it was a pretty big deal because I have to admit, it was a good job with decent pay. However, I was just upset that she hadn't even thought that she needed to talk to me about it before applying, and she told me that she didn't even think that she would get the job. But now that she had it, she was thinking of moving away and she wanted me to come along with her. She wanted to relocate our entire family knowing what my feelings on this were. So we ended up fighting over that and it was one of our worst fights. It got so bad that she ended up leaving to go and stay with her parents for a couple of days and we had no contact for those days. So I actually thought that she was going to file for a divorce and put an end to this. But then she came back home and we ended up deciding that we were going to try and patch things up between us because we still had the kids and we couldn't let them down. And back then, I thought that I could still make it work with her because I didn't want to let go of this marriage. I was sure that I loved her and she told me that she did too, which is why she wanted to make it work. But she also didn't want to give up on her dreams, and so after a lot of discussion, we decided that she was going to take up the job and I would stay back here. She told me that she was going to try and travel back and forth as often as she could so that we could make this work. We had no other option but to choose a long-distance marriage for now since neither of us was ready to give up on each other. It was hard for me to agree, but I had to do it, at least for a while, before we could figure out what we wanted to do in the future. So then she left as she would come back home every alternate weekend, but even then she would only get to spend 2 days with us and take a flight back on Sunday evening since she would have to be back for work every Monday. It was tiring for her and I knew it, but there was nothing that I could do since she had agreed to this arrangement. With time, I guess she started resenting me and her attitude towards me got worse. We had promised each other that we were going to try and make this work. But every time that I would try to call her during the week, she would always be really mean to me and we would inevitably end up arguing about something or other. After a certain point of time, it started feeling like she didn't even want to speak to me. And instead of calling her on my own, I started waiting for her to call me first and then we started speaking less to each other. And even when we would talk, it was always very cold and weird, and I didn't know what to make of it. Then, eventually, after having spent almost 4 months away, she came home one weekend and had divorce papers with her. At the time, things were really tense between us, and she told me that she couldn't do this anymore. When she came back home that weekend, we hadn't spoken for almost 6 days in a row because of the argument that we had the last time we spoke. And I wanted to come up with a reason not to get a divorce, but I couldn't come up with anything. Because the last fight that we had was one where she had actually thrown out the idea of separating and ending this marriage for good. I should have seen that coming because for months, not only had we been fighting, but she had also been getting closer to a certain friend of hers from high school. This friend, let's call her Melissa, was not a good person and was an even worse influence. Emma had always been good friends with Melissa and that woman had even been there as a bridesmaid at our wedding, but I had never liked her because she had always given off a weird vibe. From what I knew about her, she was a total gold digger and always went after rich married men so she wouldn't have to commit to them, but would still get the benefits of being with a rich guy. She would even brag about it as if what she was doing wasn't detestable enough. When I used to bring up her behavior with Emma, she used to tell me that it was her personal choice and that we shouldn't judge her. That was quite infuriating. So eventually, I just stopped talking about Melissa and decided to ignore that friendship altogether. It got easier eventually because after Melissa moved away and Emma got caught up with work and kids, they kind of drifted apart. Anyway, I had known that Melissa had also been living in the same state with her son for a couple of years since she had moved away after her second divorce, probably to scout for new prey. Coincidentally, when Emma got a job in the same state, she reached out to Melissa, and she was the one who introduced her to the city and helped her move in and stuff along with me. I was there all along and I had hoped that maybe Melissa would have sobered up after so many years, but she was still the same weird person. I was not comfortable with Emma being so close with Melissa once again, but she was the only friend that Emma had there. So I couldn't even say anything about it. In the months that Emma had been staying there, she had told me that Melissa had been really supportive of her since she was on her own and had even introduced her to a couple of her own friends. This so-called group that Melissa had introduced Emma to was very dicey because as far as I remember, it was 3 or 4 women who were all single mothers. They had met through Facebook and had a Facebook support group kind of thing together. From whatever Emma had told me, these women had all been with men and had kids with them, but due to a variety of reasons, their partners had abandoned them and now they were raising their kids on their own and the only support they got was a child support check. However, it was not as sad as it sounds because most of the women that Melissa was friends with were just like her.